DESIblitz.com.
Hey everyone, my name is Ria Kakad, and I'm today's host for DESIblitz event on why audiobooks. Today I'll be joined by Anita Nair and Jessica Stone, who will introduce themselves shortly. Just before they do so, just some housekeeping information. The event will end with a Q&A session where you will have the opportunity to ask our amazing speakers any question you would like. You can write your answers in the Q&A box below. I think we're ready to get into it. Anita, firstly, could you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Hi, my name is Anita Nair, and I've been writing for a very long time. I've written 19 books, which includes novels, short stories, poetry, books for children, essays, etc. And my work is translated into 33 languages around the world. And recently, I started doing audio stories, and I have 5 original audio stories up on Storytel India. And yeah, that's pretty much about me. And yes, I also am a high-profile supporter of the UNHCR, and I have founded a mentorship program called Anita's Attic. And I've just finished writing a crime novel, which is the 3rd novel in a series featuring Inspector Gowda.
Thank you. Jessica, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. So I'm Jessica Stone, and I am an audio producer for a UK charity called Listening Books. Listening Books offers an audiobook lending service for people who, for any number of reasons, find it difficult to read or hold a traditional printed book. So this can be something like visual impairment, or it could be something like a learning disability, or like arthritis. There's a whole bunch of different things that kind of qualify. And I oversee the production of some of the audiobooks that we do in-house, and which includes our sound learning program, which supports the national curriculum. And then I also produce a podcast which celebrates audiobooks, talking to authors and narrators and readers. So yes, that's me.
Perfect. Let's get straight into our discussion. So just to give like a little bit of more context about audiobooks, this is a question for both of you. Maybe Anita, you could start first. Obviously, Jessica, feel free to chip in. But where has the rise of audiobooks come from? And kind of like, what is the attractiveness of an audiobook over a physical or ebook?
But I think for me, this is what I hear from many of the listeners, and especially in India, where radios had a huge impact on the population, not just in the English language, but essentially in regional languages. The radio was part of everybody's life, and so it seemed like an organic movement from radio to listen to audiobooks, because it's sort of built that same sense of having this friend at your elbow. And I think increasingly that people use the time that they used to commute to work, or when they are on the road, or waiting somewhere, or when they're out on a walk in the morning or something like that. They use this time to build their corpus of knowledge. So I do know that there's a huge listenership for wellness books and self-help books, etc. But I just keep hoping that fiction will eventually also be able to find that kind of an audience.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it coincides with the rise of audio generally, and with streaming as well. So the popularity of audiobooks, I think, coincides somewhat with the rise of like podcasts. So to be able to listen to something on demand, it's no longer the inconvenience of having to purchase or borrow a CD. That makes a world of difference, and it makes it so much more practical for people who are commuting or just trying to get tasks done that don't require mental work. So I think there are a number of reasons, but it for sure is really popular right now. It's booming.
Okay, thank you. And just kind of thinking about the readers, how have you seen people benefit from audiobooks in, I guess, like a physical and mental sense? Jessica, if you'd like to start, please.
Yeah, because I'm an audio producer at Listening Books, I'm usually on the I'm always on the production side rather than the sort of client or customer facing side. But I have seen in my own life, like I'm thinking of a relative at the moment who has blepharospasms, which cause the eyes to spasm and blink uncontrollably, which has reduced her vision to about 30%. And she has always been such an avid reader. Would try to read all the big long lists for major literary prizes and things. And you can imagine like what that would do to someone if you could no longer just literally keep your eyes open long enough to read, when that had always been something that you loved and that you identified with as a reader. And she relies completely on audiobooks now. And she was telling me the last time I met her that she'd got through the entire Booker long list just through audiobooks. So I've seen it personally. And I can't help but think of there's a quote from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, which I wrote down here because I thought that maybe under pressure I wouldn't remember. But the quote goes, "Until I feared I would lose it, I never loved to read. One does not love breathing." And that always strikes me as just getting at the heart of, for someone who is an avid reader, to suddenly face the prospect of losing that. Just imagine what a gift audiobooks are in that scenario.
Perfect, thank you. Anita, do you have anything to add?
Oh, yes, I really do think that, it's also, for instance, in India, where people probably shy away from reading books in English because they think that they wouldn't understand, or books expensive in India. So what happens is that, people shy away from buying a book. It's not as expensive as probably, buying books in the Western Hemisphere, but it definitely is expensive. And I always tell this equation that the cost of a book is like the average cost of a meal for two in a fairly decent restaurant. So the choice is always going to be the meal rather than the book. So, but with audiobooks, what happens is that it opens it up to the entire world. And even if you don't have this room for books in your house, even if you don't have the courage to actually pick up like a really literary novel, when you listen to it, somehow that sense of feeling that you have to be this intellectual to read and to understand disappears. And it just becomes like you have this friend at I like using this phrase again and again, a friend at your elbow telling you a story.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think audiobooks have opened the world of stories to people who might not have easy access to books. And I think, Jessica, you kind of like work a lot on allowing literature to reach out to those people.
Yeah, that's right. So Listening Books was founded in 1959 by someone called Norma Skimp, she was involved in an accident which severely reduced her vision. And when she tried to access support for books, when she tried to access audiobooks through the traditional routes, I think she was denied access because she still had a little bit of vision. And so she realized that there was this gap, obviously, that there are lots of people who would benefit from audiobooks who aren't blind completely. There are lots of ways that you can that you could benefit from the additional support that audiobooks offer. So I think I mentioned before some of the different categories. I mean, that could be mental health conditions like anxiety, and it could be learning disabilities like dyslexia. It could be something like ADHD, because if you think about how audiobooks allow you to do something else while you're listening, that's immensely helpful for people who find it really hard to just focus in on the one thing. So yeah, it is incredible to me, like the breadth of people that audiobooks can be a support to. And of course, like many things that are a support for people with disabilities, it also becomes immensely practical for people who don't have any disability or impairment or condition that requires it. It's actually immensely practical for the rest of us as well.
I'd just like to add to this that, I know a lot of people who hesitate picking up a book, and they tell me, yes, I read books. I don't read books, and I just read magazines, because the girth of a book sometimes frightens them. And, when it's out there in audio, what happens is that they don't have to deal with that physical book, and they, are listening when they're driving or traveling on a bus or even doing the dishes or walking the dog, whatever it is, or doing the household chores. And at the same time, they learn to develop this fondness for books. And I always think that I hope that, audiobooks, for those who are, not physically challenged in some way, or mentally, having kind of problems that stops them, they're overwhelmed by the idea of reading a book. I think audiobooks are almost like a nursery ski slope. It takes them from there to probably wanting to pick up a book, a physical book, and reading it. I'm not saying one is an alternative to the other. All I'm just saying is that one could probably lead to the other.
Perfect. Thank you both so much. Just to get more into kind of like the nitty-gritty of like the content of an audiobook. Anita, how would you say that there's a difference when you're thinking about writing for an audiobook in comparison to like a physical book?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Because, when I'm writing an audio story or, an audio novella, which is what I've been doing now, I've done 5 audio novellas. And I find that I don't have the time to engage with the listener like I would with a reader. Because a reader would probably, give me that much of indulgence and, want to read the first 5 pages before they decide whether they like the book or not. But with audio, I don't have that luxury, and I need to bring in the listener and get him or her riveted to the story in probably the first 1 minute. Which would be like about 2 paragraphs of time, or let's say about 300 words maximum. And so I find that I need to kind of write very differently, and also the way you use words, because when a narrator is reading out a story, if you're going to be using too many sibilant sounds, then sometimes it can just be a lot of hiss and hiss. Sorry, I don't mean it that way. What I meant, hiss and hiss and hiss. So, so I find that I'm more sensitive to the sound of the word as I am to the meaning of the word.
Perfect, thank you. Jessica, do you have anything to add here?
Well, I have heard authors say to me that hearing their work read aloud or reading it aloud themselves in different settings does affect the way that they write, that they can tell that something's not working when they hear it read aloud or when they're reading it themselves aloud. And some of that has to do with, this is often in a live context, so they can literally see the audience reaction. But some of it is just, if you're tripping over it as you're reading it, you realize, oh, actually, I need to edit this. I need to change this to flow better. So I would just, I'm not a writer myself, though. I'm just adding what authors have told me about that experience.
Thank you. I guess even kind of like the person who speaks and tells the story, I guess that can have like a big influence on how the story is portrayed as well. So, Jessica, what do you look for when casting for an audiobook?
Yeah, I when I talk to people who listen to audiobooks, it becomes very clear very quickly that the narrator is the make or break factor for an audiobook success. But generally, people don't necessarily realize all that goes into it. So they would sort of say that they liked their voice or they didn't. And when you dig deeper, it really has very little to do with their actual voice, which is sort of the least of the things. I mean, obviously, you don't want someone whose voice is going to irritate the listener necessarily, but the things that I have learned to really appreciate in voice actors and professional narrators include things like consistency of pacing. Like you wouldn't maybe necessarily think of that as a real skill, but to be able to read at the same pace without it becoming, of course, in any way monotone or anything, but to be able to read consistently at the same pace and with the same tone, and be able to jump back in with a correction, a retake if that's necessary, and maintain that is a great skill. I appreciate the stamina that experienced narrators bring, because you are often, when you're recording, you're often in usually in a small room in a recording booth, and there's often no natural light in there because there are no windows, because we're trying to keep outside noise out. And so you're often in this cave-like surrounding. And it's for hours at a time. And, obviously, we try to make sure that everybody gets frequent breaks because it's just too much otherwise. But to be able to do that and keep the same energy and the same pace the whole day, I really, really admire actors who can do that. I love actors who are able to actually acknowledge the punctuation that is there and not the punctuation that they've decided in their head is what should be there. So I've just learned to appreciate some different qualities in actors. And of course, I want to match the right actor with the right book, in terms of tone, and the publisher and the author would have a lot of say in that as well. But I'm looking for somebody that I can work with for several, for long days at a time, and who doesn't get flustered when they make mistakes, because it happens all the time.
Thank you. Anita, can you bring anything from an author's perspective?
Oh, yes. The reason being that, I narrated one of my own audio stories, which was titled "Why I Killed My Husband." I didn't think there were too many actors who were ready to stand up there and, narrate the story. And I also narrated a collection of my own short stories called "Satyr of the Subway." And I get exactly what Jessica was talking about having stamina, because the recording engineer, the sound engineer, would keep telling me that. So I'm a trained musician, so he'd say that it's only the training in music that's giving you the stamina to keep going at exactly the same pace without losing losing the timbre of the voice, because sometimes when you're exhausted, your voice can start reflecting that exhaustion. And I also realized that with my own stories, that with the original stories, that it's so essential to match the voice of the actor with the story itself. So I spent a lot of time thinking about who should do it. And then I have a long discussion with my producer, and of course, and then, the economics of it has to work out, etc. But we always try and look for a voice that is so reflective of the protagonist of the story. So I just did the last story that I did was called Quota Girls. And quota as in, reservation quota, etc. The quota is that old-fashioned word used a lot in India. And it was the voice of the protagonist is that of a young girl who's about 17 or 18. And we had to be sure that the voice reflected that naivety, that innocence, and all of that. It couldn't be this voice that was striated with age and experience. So I think it's very essential to match the voice with what is being read out.
Perfect, thank you. And just kind of thinking about, I'm a huge reader, and I personally think that whilst both audiobooks and physical books have like equal value, kind of the experience that you get from reading a book and listening to an audiobook is quite different. So, Anita, do you think that audiobooks have changed the way that stories are told? I guess, like, going back centuries, the way stories have been told are through kind of like oral. But yeah, how have audiobooks changed the way that stories are told?
So I would think that, when I'm writing my fiction, which is going to be read and maybe eventually listened to because it becomes an audiobook, the way I write is very different from the way I, write an original audio story, because I do realize that there's a certain element of chattiness that comes into the way you, write an audio story, an original audio story, because you want to feel that, like the way when a reader picks up a book and starts reading and they kind of slip into the pages of the book and they feel that everything that's happening there is happening to them. You need to be able to evoke that exact feeling in the listener and make them feel that they're not eavesdropping, but they are actually participating in what is happening in, through the words that are being spoken to them.
Can I add a bit to that question? The question kind of reminded me of conversations that are often had around whether audiobooks are in some way cheating. If you can call listening to audiobooks the same as reading, and for all the differences that there might be in the way that we consume them. Really interesting studies that have come out have shown that the activity in the brain is really nearly identical in those experiences, that there's the same intensity and the same regions of the brain that are lighting up with activity, whether you're reading printed material or whether you're listening to an audiobook. And when I think about that, really, it does make sense from a linguistic perspective of decoding something that is abstract, because we may not think about it, but of course, spoken language is also an abstraction from the actual thing that you're describing. So the decoding still has to happen. And so paying attention to a written book and paying attention to an audiobook are virtually identical in our brains. And I thought it was surprising to me, and then it made sense to me. So I just thought I would add that to the discussion.
Oh, no, I do think it's a marvelous insight, because I've always wondered how does the reader / listener experience the book, when they're reading and when they're listening to it. And I somewhere deep within me, I had this feeling that eventually, if you have to bring in a reader / listener into a story or into whatever is being, even if it's an essay or it's a children's book, you need to be able to kind of find your way into their brain as much as their heart, as much as their soul. And so I guess the passage to all three parts of our existence is pretty much the same. It's not like there are two different channels. This is one channel. It's just that it's two different roads that come into the channel.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, just thinking again more about like the content of an audiobook versus a physical book. How can an audiobook bring a character to life? And do you think it's difficult to do so compared to reading on paper? Anita, maybe you could go first.
So one of the things that I've discovered when I was writing original audio content was that I could actually, find that connection with the listener when I do the first person narrative rather than the third person. So the moment I start a story saying why I killed my husband, it immediately kind of finds this hook within the listener. And they actually assume whoever is reading, whether it's me or anybody else, they're actually talking about themselves. So there's this great sense of intimacy that you can create between the narrator and the listener by simply using the first person narrative more than anything else. And I think that distance that exists between the storyteller and the listener is completely erased by using the first person narrative. So that's a kind of huge insight I had after trying to do it in third person and then doing the same paragraph in first person, and I found the difference. And I was like, okay, from now on, when I'm doing my original audio stories, I will use the first person. And as a writer, I love being able to slip into the skins of various kinds of characters. So on the one hand, I'm writing about this elderly man living in a tiny village in Kerala in India. And on the other hand, I'm writing about this 17-year-old young girl who's studying in a medical college. So as a writer, it's wonderful to be able to slip into the characters. And when I use the first person narrative, I feel that I'm speaking from the heart of the character rather than, looking at them from a distance.
Can I add something to this as well, Ria? Just in terms of bringing characters to life, it just made me think about a book that I read some years back. I started to read it in the printed version, and then I found it available as an audiobook in the library. And so I switched to that, and it made such a difference. And the reason was because a lot of the book was written in a very specific regional dialect of Ireland. It was a Cork accent and dialect. And the thing is, you can spend the sort of mental energy in trying to decode a dialect that you're not familiar with and the lingo. And you can do that. You can get through it, and that's rewarding in a sense. But actually, to hear the actor who could deliver it with the right, not just accent, but there's a rhythm that comes with these regional dialects, and it's so wonderful to hear it, and it adds so much to your understanding of the material. Suddenly, there's this barrier kind of lifted, because once you can hear the rhythm of it and how it's being said, a lot of that burden is lifted. It's sort of taken away to allow you to enjoy the story in a much more natural way. It was one of my first experiences where I realized what a dramatic difference it could be to read the audiobook version of something. I really loved it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I always find that with I don't really read too many fantasy books, but I love listening to them. I feel like it just opens up like a whole new world for me, like as a reader. So yeah, I think even when the author is trying to portray like different accents and different dialects of like these fantasy characters, whether they're fairies, werewolves, whatever. But yeah, it's quite nice like hearing that. So yeah, thank you both again. So I guess I've spoken about kind of like how I prefer fantasy novels in kind of like an audio format. But just thinking about like genres of different books, what genres would you say work well in an audiobook format? Anita, maybe you could go first.
Well, I think I think it's really, for me, what works very well is the kind of stories where I'm able to make a social commentary on what is happening. I think for me, it's also drawn from the fact that I do hope that by using the audio format, I would find more people who I want them to hear this point of view I have, and it's a kind of need to be able to talk about things that are happening around me, and I know that if I were to write about it, they would probably be intimidated by the idea of having to read a book that probably was like, word heavy. But if I were to narrate the same story, and the choice of words, the cadence, and all of that would make a huge difference, and I would be able to reach a greater number of listeners. Um, hate using words like consumers of data and stuff like that. So I just say listeners, and I know that that there's going to be a huge impact I can make by talking to them about things that we need to be talking about and we don't really talk about. So I use my original audio stories to talk about things that worry me about what's going on in the world in terms of generally the human condition. And I know that I can do social commentary better with audio rather than when I were to, contain it within the pages of a book.
I think most genres work well as audiobooks. I think a couple that stand out to me as particularly good candidates are memoirs and poetry. And in both cases, if they are read by their authors and those authors are good readers, then that's an ideal combination, because in both of those cases, there is usually such a strong sense of voice in the text, and the person who's written them is most familiar with that voice and how they want it read. So when you get, with the very big caveat that as long as the authors are good readers, you can't be good at everything. So it's it's okay if you need to get somebody else, but then they need to be able to get that voice and know how to deliver that. So, but I do think that those in particular make very good candidates for audiobooks. But like I said, I think most genres do work well as audiobooks.
That's really interesting. I'd never thought about kind of like listening to a poetry book. I always find that with poetry anyway, like I need to be in a certain mindset and a certain mood, as much as I love it, but there needs to be a certain time to read it. And I think I'll definitely feel like just accessing poetry. I feel like I've never thought about it in an audio format. So thank you so much. I think even with kind of like authors, kind of like reading their own book. I know that with there's a book by the Receipts podcast. So they are obviously, it's a podcast, so they are more audio. And I did pick up their book to read, and I was like, this isn't working. But when I listened to the audiobook, which they kind of like narrated themselves, it was like a completely different experience. That's really interesting. Again, thank you so much. Cool. So just to kind of like finish off my questions, we'll be then moving on to the Q&A. But where do you see kind of like the future of audiobooks? What can you foresee? Anita, maybe if you have any thoughts.
I'm not really certain about the future of audiobooks in English in India, but I definitely do think in a country like India, where we have so many languages, that we still only have a very small percentage of people who actually speak, read, and write English. The audiobook is probably just this huge explosion waiting to happen, especially in the regional languages, because, we still have a very different kind of economy compared to the rest of the world. And this could be something that could be a part of every person's life, whether you're driving a tractor, plowing the fields, or whether you are working as an attendant in a a petrol pump or something like that. It doesn't matter, because you could actually do the reading. I mean, you could do the listening while you're doing everything else with your hands. You don't have to actually engage your mental faculties entirely into the activity that you're doing. And so I do feel that if it's formatted in a way which makes it affordable, and it's probably not bound too much to, that's going to be a huge challenge in terms of the digital world, because you still have a huge population who have to get used to the idea of audiobooks. But like I said earlier, we do have this cultural tie with the radio in India, like in many parts of the world. And so if the listener just feels that the audiobook is merely another kind of radio, then probably I think we would see like a super explosion of listeners. I mean, people coming in, more and more listeners coming in. But I think this whole thing needs to be packaged and talked about without making it seem like this is only a very elitist kind of recreational activity.
I don't know that I can see the future, but I don't anticipate the audiobook business slowing down anytime soon. I do think it's kind of expensive to produce audiobooks, and it's kind of difficult enough in the publishing world for books to make money. I think that is always the struggle. And so to invest the money into producing a good audiobook and see a return on that is kind of the challenge. And I am also aware that a lot of, unless you're a big name in the audiobook narration world, or you're already a known celebrity and actor or whatever, you don't really get paid all that well in comparison to other voiceover opportunities. You could get paid a lot more for less work if you were just doing a commercial, for example. And so the people who are doing audiobook narration, I have a lot of admiration for them, and a lot of them are doing it because they love it and they love reading as well, and they want to offer this. And at least in the part of the sector that I'm in, it's most common to charge to pay narrators according to the final finished time. So however many hours the audiobook ends up being, that's what they get. That's what their rate is based on, not how many hours they've actually put into the preparation and the recording and all of that. And so I kind of anticipate there being more of a standardization among audiobook narrators of what's a fair rate of pay and a fair way of being paid. And of course, that has to work in conjunction with audiobook production being affordable enough for people to do it and still make money on the selling of the books, just from a purely practical standpoint,
No, that's really interesting to hear. And I hope, there's a lot more discussion on kind of like pay in kind of like the audiobook industry, especially when it comes to kind of like the narrators, because they're a huge part of it as well. They're the ones who are bringing kind of like the story to life. So yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you. And I think just kind of like a comment, just overall on audiobooks, I think, and thinking about access. My local library have launched kind of like a digital service where they audiobooks and also ebooks, and I think that's like a really great way of kind of localizing kind of just reading. I think there's like obviously a lot of voices talking about support your local library. We want to move away from kind of like the big sellers who are kind of like capitalizing books, but I think it's really nice to kind of have a your local library service lending out audiobooks too. So if you're not aware of that, make sure that you go and check out if your local library is kind of like lending out audiobooks. I know it can be quite expensive as well. So that's definitely a really nice way to access them too. Great, perfect. Thank you so much. We've got some time now to move on to our Q&A session. So if you have any questions still, please feel free, to add it in the Q&A box below. We've got some questions for you already, so perfect. We can get ready. We can get started on that. So one question is, how long does it take to create an audiobook, the process and production times?
Would you like me to take this one?
Yeah, sure.
It depends on the size of the book. But for, let's say, a 100,000 word book, you would spend a good 4 intense days in the recording studio for that. There'd be a good amount of time beforehand that the reader is preparing. They'll be reading the book and making their notes. They'll be highlighting any character voices or any directions in the text that come after the fact. When you get some dialogue and then it says she whispered and you're like, oops, I just shouted that. So they'll be like, noting things like that. So they would spend their time preparing their text. And then we would spend 4 to 5 intense days in the studio recording. And then after that, it would be over to someone like me to do the post-production, which would be editing out any mistakes that were left in there, noting any retakes that still need to be done that might have been missed during the recording session, and then mastering to take care of things like that hissing that Anita was talking about. When you get so many, there are things we can do to mitigate that and make that less obtrusive, and that I would. To be honest, I can't, off the top of my head, tell you exactly how long that would take, because I don't have we actually have a calculator for this where we put in the word count and then it comes up with an estimated time that it would take to record and then to do edits and then to do the proofread after that. Because then there's, of course, the proof listening, the quality control step after that. Because at any point during this process, something could slip in. So I hope that helps answer that question somewhat.
I'd like to add to it by saying that the writing process of the story itself isn't very different. It takes, the only thing is that you need to kind of remember with an audiobook, especially, that there is a word count or a time limit. So I might be commissioned to write an audio story, which is an hour long. So I need to be able to make sure that it's contained within that time rather than just go on for like 3 hours, because that's not what they have, I think, budgeted for. And so I find that's the only thing. So once I know what the time of this audio story is going to be, and how much time I have, then I need to be able to capture the entire story within that word limit. Barring that, I don't think there is any difference in the way that the writing process itself happens.
Perfect, thank you. Moving on to our next question. So this one's more about kind of like the pay between an audiobook author and kind of like a physical book writer. Is there like a difference?
Well, I do think that it's essential for the audiobook writer to be, what I talked about earlier, which is to be able to be very, very sensitive to the sound of the word as much as what it means. There's a huge, because, when a person is actually reading a book, a physical book, if there is a word that they don't understand or a phrase they don't understand, they do have the time to, put the book down and, pick up their phone or pick up a dictionary and check the meaning of the word. or check the actual way the phrase is used. But if you were to do that with audiobooks, what happens is that you lose the momentum of the reading and how it's going. So that is it's an interruption in the whole experience of listening to a book. So I think those are things, that these small nuances that the writer has to be careful about.
Perfect, thank you. And another question that's just come in: which language is popular in India for an audiobook?
So it's actually, the audiobook market in regional languages is still pretty in its nascent stage. So it's very hard to actually put a figure to it and say that that probably Malayalam is doing more than Hindi or Bengali and that kind of thing, because we have so many languages. But I do know that with English, you still don't really touch like the bulk of the population. You only touch like a very, very, very fine layer, because it requires the person to have some knowledge, a working knowledge of the language, some working knowledge of how to access the story itself, and the ability to pay for it. So there are so many factors that come into it. So at this point, I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't have the data to tell you which is the most popular Indian language for audiobooks.
Perfect, thank you. And a question has come in about more if anyone wanted to record an audiobook, write an audiobook. Is it possible to record your own audiobook and then sell it, or do you have to go through a publisher's?
Yeah, I think I can answer this. Listening books, for example, one of the things that we would do is produce audiobooks for people who pay us to do that. And it has nothing to do with our audiobook lending service, except that it helps fund the charity. So these aren't books that are going into our catalogue. They're just books that we would produce for either publishers or individuals who wanted their book recorded as an audiobook. And so we would quote for them, we would give them a price based on how much production time we estimate that it would take. Like I said, we've got a calculator for all this. But we don't distribute. So there are various distribution sites. I think ACX may be the most well-known one. And there are some other ones that I can't think of off the top of my head. But what listening books would do, for example, is give you, we would produce the audiobook, give it to you in the format that you require, and then the client would then distribute it through whatever distribution service they wanted, whether that was ACX or something else.
Perfect, thank you. And what are the most important factors when creating an audiobook?
I think it's very important to have a very strong protagonist. It's very important not to kind of go overboard on descriptions, because purple prose as it is hard work for anybody to wade through, and it's even more difficult when you have to hear it. Because with a book, you have the option of just flipping the page and moving on to the action. So it's also very important to maintain the pace of the story and to distribute all the conflict points and resolution points in such a way that you don't have, you don't start the story with a huge flourish and then it sags in the middle and then falls flat by the end of the story. So you need to be able to pace it. So I think pretty much many of the points that a writer writing a book, a physical book, would consider is exactly what you need to consider when writing an original audio story, except that you need to remember that it's very important to be able to be very word sensitive.
I would just say that, like, taking for granted that the writing is good and engaging, it really does come down to the casting as the most important choice that's made in audiobook production. Finding the right narrator to bring it alive is just so key. And then the producer's job, besides finding the right narrator, is then to make sure that the sound quality doesn't detract at all, that you're not distracted by any hissing, for example, those sibilant S's, that there are no thumps in the background, that the pacing is consistent, you just don't want to be distracted from the story. You want the listener to be wholly immersed.
Just about kind of like, again, different types of audiobooks. A question's come in asking, are drama and actor-based audiobooks more appealing than just narration ones?
Personally speaking, I know that I don't like a dramatic rendition of an audio book, because one of the joys about reading or listening is you give the character a voice in your mind as you're reading it. The cadence they use, the timbre of their voice, all of that is something that the listener / the reader actually gives the voice that they are reading. So when you have a dramatic rendition, what happens is that it's robbing you of that emotional connect with the story, and you are forced to listen to the rendition in the way the actor perceives it. So I like a straight narration for my books, and I mean I could be a minority here, but this is how I feel about dramatic renditions versus straight reading.
I think because for me, the talent of an audiobook narrator is genuinely in the narration. It's in the storytelling. And while actors can very often be good audiobook narrators, it's not necessarily so. There's overlap, but I think audiobook narration is its own specific skill. And not all actors have that. But yeah, even if it's just narration, I think that can be done really beautifully in audiobook format.
Thank you. And another question has come in too. Do you think audiobooks will impact reading skills in the future?
I hope it does, because I have this image of this person listening to an audio story while holding the actual book in their hand, and kind of like listening and reading at the same time. I mean, but maybe this is just one of those utopian dreams, but this is what I hope would eventually happen.
I love the way you answered that, Anita, actually, because when I heard that question, I thought they were saying it in a negative sense, like would listening to audiobooks impair someone's ability to read if they got too dependent on listening to it. But I don't think so. Partly because of what I said about the activity in the brain being virtually identical, but also because we read all the time, even when we're not reading books. I mean, social media, articles on the web, like we're constantly reading, and so no, I don't think that would impair anybody's ability to read, and because we are still decoding words and following a story, it doesn't impair those aspects of it either.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. When I was younger, I had a collection of books which had like a CD that goes alongside it. So that really helped me to read. I was listening to the story whilst kind of like pointing along like the actual physical book. So I completely agree. So I think this is our final question. But this person said that they want to get into audiobooks, but how difficult is it to make the transition from physical books to an audiobook?
In terms of writing, in terms of imbibing,
in terms of reading,
in terms of reading out, or just reading? Oh, I don't think there is a difference, because the thing is, like I said, it's about when you are reading a book, you can't do anything else, right? You just can only read a book at that point. So I do think that it's a question of being able to choose when you want to read. Like, you might want to lounge in a chair with a cup of tea at hand, and and a biscuit, and read a book, which is a very leisurely activity. Or you might want to be doing the dishes, or gardening, or standing in a line to buy something, and you still have your headphones on and you can listen to a book. So I really think ultimately it's going to be a matter of choice of what you want to do when you are reading. Whether do you want to just focus on it, or do you want to try and multitask?
I think so. Interestingly, my mother has recently got into audiobooks, and I think at first she might have found it a little bit, like, she might not have been too sure about it, because she didn't necessarily get the best narrator the first time that she, the first audiobook that she listened to. And that obviously can make a huge difference. And in fact, the first time I listened to an audiobook, there was a narrator that really annoyed me. And thankfully that didn't put me off. I did listen to some others that helped me realize that wasn't a given. But I think the other potential pitfall is, especially if you're a fast reader, it can be annoying at first to go at the pace that the reader is going. But you should know that in most apps that you'd be listening to an audiobook with, you have some controls that you can speed it up if you want to. You can speed it up to 1.2 times or 1.5 times so that it goes at a pace that you like better. So I think that would help if if that's one of the things that you find frustrating about audiobooks. And then the other thing would be to find narrators that you really like. Yeah, I mean, you can start off even just by doing an internet search for the best audiobook narrators, and you can further specify by genre and region and language, and try some out and get an idea of who you like to hear listened to. And I think that would help. But if you get one that has a bad narrator, or one that you don't like, you can give up on that. You can say, this audiobook is not for me, but don't let it put you off trying another one, because there are some really wonderful audiobooks out there and narrators who really bring them to life.
Well, thank you. I think that's just reading in general as well. If you don't like the book, put it down. Stop.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you both. It's been an amazing discussion. And on behalf of DESIblitz, I'd like to say thank you for all of you for attending and your amazing questions. The Literature Festival doesn't stop here. It's taking place until the 25th of November at the Mac Arena in Birmingham. We also have some online events too. For more information and to stay up to date with DESIblitz events, you can visit our website, DESIblitz.com, and also check out our social media pages. So thank you all again. Thank you, Anita and Jessica. We hope to see you all again.
Thank you, Ria.
Thank you, Ria. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Anita.